Morning, everyone. I'm just going to wait a second and let people join us before I launch into this week's Learn with Lorna. So, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 29th in the series. One thing I want to know, and I know some people will be watching this live, and some people will watch it later on. Welcome if you're new. Is anybody watching for the first time? Have you watched every single one of them? I'm seeing people saying hello already who I know have been regular viewers, but it's quite interesting. Some people kind of set their watch by making sure they're here on a Thursday, and then some people I've been seeing saying, I've never heard of these before and came across them by chance. So it's interesting to know how many people are watching. So thank you for watching, and thank you also for how many times these films have been viewed. We marked 88,000 views last week, which is extraordinary and really wonderful, and I'm so grateful to you. For people who are saying I have sunshine, Carolyn, I actually have a light pointed at my face. The reason being that a few weeks ago somebody said that it was much easier to lip read when I had a light pointed directly at my face, so I've been trying to do that. Thank you for last week, for those who joined with last week's Learn with Lorna. It was the highest views we've had. We're about 7,000 views for that one film on the crofters and cotters. So that was really nice. And some of the things that I talked about during last week's will tie into this week's subject as well. So before I go any further, just to say that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no charge, no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or no subscription required to take part in this series of films. We are very grateful if anyone is able to donate towards the Highland Archive Service, and thank you so much for those who have done so. It's truly appreciated and enables us to carry on doing the range of work that we do, and we're very, very grateful. So this week we're looking at the history of Inverness Castle, and we're looking at the Spirit of the Highlands project. It's unusual for me. I'm starting sort of a couple of thousand years ago, and then I'm working right through into the future, which is quite unusual, as people will know who have watched them. High Life Highland are absolutely delighted to be involved in the Spirit of the Highlands project. It's a project that's supported by the Inverness and Highlands City Region Deal. It has key partners including the Highland Council, the Scottish Government, the UK Government, High Life Highland, and a range of other partners. So if anyone is watching who is involved in the University of the Highlands and Islands or any of the other organisations who are involved, then please do say hello so that people can see you. So what I'm going to start by doing is giving you the history of Inverness Castle, and then go towards the end into the Spirit of the Highlands project and what that means for the future, both of the castle and also how that's going to impact on the wider Highlands. For those of you who know Inverness, you'll be familiar with the castle. If anyone doesn't, then please do have a look, have a search online of the building, or have a look on our website, Ambala. There's some fantastic pictures of the castle on there. And I know quite a lot of people have commented on the pictures I put up on Tuesday, a lot of comments about those memories of the castle. It's an absolutely beautiful building. It's on a very prominent site right in the middle of the city centre. It has beautiful views. It looks over the River Ness. It looks north to Ben Wyvis. It's an absolutely stunning location, as so many of our castles are. If you came not being part of not living in the Highlands and you came up towards the castle, you might quite assume that it was going to be a tourist attraction, but in fact it is not. For 180 years the castle has served as a court, and the current building, and again it depends where you're watching from, I know sometimes Americans and others will laugh at this sentence, but from our point of view in the Highlands it's quite a young building. It was built in the 1830s and 40s, so really not a very old building, but the stories that building has seen and that previous castles on that site have seen are quite extraordinary. And so I want to tell you some of those things and tell you how what has happened in Inverness Castle has shaped both the lives of the people in the Highlands, but also it's shaped the image of the Highlands to the rest of Scotland and to across the world. There's a very key image, I think, of the Highlands, and a lot of that can be seen through things that have happened in the castle. So I'm going to start, as I say, thousands of years ago. So one of the earliest things that we know about Castle Hill and the site of the castle, we actually only discovered in 1985. There was an excavation on Castle Hill, and it revealed that there had been a tsunami that had come up Castle Hill and onto the site of the castle in the Mesolithic period, so somewhere between 20,000 and 8,000 years ago. We think around about 8,000 years ago. So obviously that's long before we know of a castle on the site, but also for those of you who are familiar with what I do, it's certainly long before the period I usually work in, because they weren't writing it down at the time. We don't know when the first castle was actually built on Castle Hill. We don't know for sure, but it was probably during the reign of King David I of Scotland, which was 1124 to 1153. There had been a fortification in the town prior to this, just probably not on that site. So we know St Columba came to Inverness. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the name of St Columba, so heavily involved in bringing Christianity to Scotland. And he visited the fortress of Kingbrood in about 650 CE, which is Common Era. There was also possibly a castle or a fortress of some kind at the Old Castle Road. So there's possibly a clue in the title there. And we think that overlooked the eastern approaches into Inverness. And tradition says that Malcolm Canmore had that castle burnt to the ground because it was the seat of his rival, Macbeth. So if you saw when I was posting about this on Tuesday, there's so many big names involved in the history of castles in Inverness. And so there's Macbeth, one of the first big names. So in the late 1200s and early 1300s, a very important time for Scottish history, this was the First War of Scottish Independence. And what I'm going to do throughout this, you'll be familiar, I only have half an hour, so I can't go into a huge amount of detail on any of these subjects. And I hope that any historians watching will forgive me as I try to give a very brief overview of huge and complex subjects. But in the late 1200s and early 1300s, the First War of Scottish Independence. And to give you a little bit of background into how this came about and how Inverness was involved, King Alexander III of Scotland died in 1286. There was no immediate heir to the throne, and his nearest living relative was his granddaughter, who was Margaret, the Maid of Norway. And she was just an infant at the time, just a very young child, and the throne passed to her. Now, King Edward I of England was also related to the family, and of course paying a very keen attention to who the throne went to in Scotland. And so he arranged for his son to marry Margaret, so that he would have a hold still to the throne of Scotland, or connection still to the throne of Scotland. But unfortunately, the child died on her way to Scotland. She died in Orkney before she arrived, and so once again there was no monarch. And there were rival sides claiming the throne, including John Comyn of Badenoch and Robert the Bruce. And King Edward of England was asked to choose who should be the next monarch. And he chose a man called John Balliol, who became king from 1292 to 1296. But it didn't stop there, because King Edward I constantly intervened in Scottish politics. He saw this as an opportunity to take an overlordship and be involved in the running of Scotland's politics. And all of this came to a head when England declared war on France, and Scotland, instead of siding with England, signed a treaty with France. And therefore, England attacked Scotland. John Balliol gave up the throne, and William Wallace became the guardian of the kingdom. Now, as I say, that's a very whistle-stop tour through a very important thing, but you're maybe wondering how this ties into Inverness Castle. It ties in because across Scotland there were battles for control of the throne, with both sides vying to take control of the throne. There were attacks on Urquhart Castle, and there were attacks on Inverness Castle, and Inverness Castle was repeatedly captured by both sides throughout the 12 and 1300s. I find it extraordinary, and you'll see this through several things that I say in this talk, extraordinary to try and imagine what life would have been like. I can almost see Inverness Castle from my house, it's not far away from me, and to look at that site and think what life must have been like as people are battling, burning the castle down, fighting, taking over. It's quite extraordinary to try and think about it. So in 1297, Inverness Castle was seized by Andrew de Murray, and he was on his way to fight at the Battle of Stirling Bridge with William Wallace. And on his way, he seized Inverness Castle. Thank you for saying you're spellbound. That's exciting for me. The castle was then returned to English hands, and this ongoing jostling for power over the throne continued. And eventually it was won by Robert the Bruce, who had killed John Comyn, his rival, and he was crowned king. And he spent the winter of 1307 travelling around Scotland, trying to win support, trying to win people onto his side, and dealing with his enemies. And as part of that, Robert the Bruce came to Inverness Castle and burned it to the ground. So already, we're only at 1307, and already it's had quite a turbulent history. So we go into the 13 and 1400s, and this is the time of the Lord of the Isles. Now, the Lord of the Isles ruled the Western Highlands and Islands pretty much as a separate kingdom. They were, in some regards, brutal and ruthless and very powerful. And one of my colleagues describes them as the bad boys of the Highlands, so that gives you an idea. And in 1369, John MacDonald of Islay, who was the first to use the title Lord of the Isles, he submitted to the authority of King David II at Inverness Castle. So he agreed to come under the authority of the king, and that huge thing happened at Inverness Castle, which had been rebuilt by this point. But gradually that relationship deteriorated. And again, it's all to do with vying for control. The Lords of the Isles did not want to come under the authority of the throne, and the throne didn't want to give up part of the kingdom. And so there's vying for control, and again, Inverness Castle is caught in that crossfire frequently. So in 1428, Alexander, the Lord of the Isles, was imprisoned in Inverness Castle by King James I. And then after his release, he was furious, returned to Inverness and burned the castle and the town to the ground in revenge. And the castle suffered several more times throughout that era before finally the Lordship of the Isles was curtailed in 1493. So again, a very turbulent time in history, and Inverness Castle right at the centre of that story. So we move into the 1500s, and there's evidence at this time that the castle was rebuilt and refurbished, and a lot of improvements were put in. So at this point there was a chapel, there was a hall, there were kitchens added. And we come to 1562, which is one of the big stories from Inverness Castle's history. Another of our big names. Mary Queen of Scots, by 1562, she had been on the throne for a year, and she was travelling across her northern territories to travel around to meet people, to do a tour of the land that she was in charge of. And she arrived in Inverness on the 11th of September 1562, and she was only aged 19 at this point, which I think we don't always take into account when we think about these big names in history, that they weren't always in their 50s, 60s. She's 19 at the time she comes here. George Gordon, who was he was the Earl of Huntly, he was a Catholic, and he was the Sheriff of Inverness and the Governor of the castle. When Mary Queen of Scots arrived, she tried to gain entry to Inverness Castle, which you would think would be quite easy if you were the Queen, but she was denied entry to the castle. And the reason for this was that she had made an enemy of George Gordon, because she had given the Earldom of Murray to James Stewart, who was her half-brother, who was a Protestant. And this is really, in a way it's always been, but this is where we really start to see religious conflict coming in. So she'd already made an enemy of the governor of the castle. And so when she arrived in Inverness and tried to get in, he refused to let her into the castle. And so instead she stayed in a house on Bridge Street, which became known as Queen Mary's House. And if you're able to have a look on Ambala, you can see some pictures of that building, and some people may remember the building. An absolutely lovely house, became known as Queen Mary's House. And the Frasers and the Macintoshes and the Munros came to her aid, and they laid siege to Inverness Castle to get her entry to it. And within 3 days, they had recaptured the castle. And the keeper of the castle, who was Alexander Gordon, was hanged for his defiance to Queen Mary. So again, a big name. So we've had Macbeth, we've had Robert Bruce, we've had Mary Queen of Scots, and these are just the big names. You know, there are a lot of other players involved in this story. And then we come to the 1600s and the Covenanting Wars. And again, forgive me, I'm going to kind of quickly gloss over what this means, but I probably won't do it justice. The Covenanting Wars, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, were by and large wars of religion and politics. So this is to do with many Scots supporting the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, who had a Calvinist doctrine, and opposing Catholicism. And of course, this leads to conflict. And as I say, that is a very basic overview of something that, of course, is not simple. And of course, by this point, you'll not be surprised to hear Inverness Castle caught up in the middle of the Covenanting Wars. So in 1644, the castle was occupied by Covenanting troops who were defending the whole area against the Royalist general James Graham, who was the Marquis of Montrose. So the castle is seized and occupied by Covenanting troops. And then in 1649, King Charles I was executed, a big, key, massive moment in British history, the first and only time that has happened. And the whole situation escalated. And the castle was seized then by Royalist troops who were supporting Charles II, but they withdrew when the Covenanters' army approached. And again, over the next few years, further attacks on the castle, moving from side to side as power switched. But the castle survived all of this, and we have a record that by the end of the 1600s, it had become a lavish 5-storey castle tower. It had interiors painted by Italian artists, and had come to a moment of peace. This takes us to the 1700s. Of course, I'm sure many of you will be familiar, this is a decade of upheaval and a massive shaping of the image of the Highlands. Many Jacobite activities took place right across the Highlands, but from an Inverness point of view, a lot of those were centred around the castle. If you remember Jacobite Week, you'll remember me going, I love the Jacobites. And funny, it's not for any kind of political or reason other than that it's such a fascinating time in our history that really shaped the Highlands, shaped Scotland, and shaped the image of the Highlands to the rest of the world. If you haven't watched it, do go back and watch the Jacobite Learn with Lorna. Again, these battles are to do with religion and sovereignty and who's in charge. And so there were Jacobite risings in 1689, including one in Cromdale, a battle in Cromdale, in 1715, in 1719, and of course in 1745-46. I have spoken about some of this in Jacobite Week, but I can't talk about the castle and not go into this. In 1715, William Macintosh of Borlum took a garrison of 100 men, put John Mackenzie of Coole in charge, and took over the castle. This was a huge turning point, 1715, a huge turning point in the history of the country from a Jacobite point of view. And so they garrisoned the castle with a Jacobite garrison of soldiers to try and ensure that the Jacobites were in control of Inverness. There were there were guns forcibly mounted on the castle, and we have in our archives the receipt for that. We have the piece of paper written in 1715 where someone was told to put guns around the castle. We have the Inverness Borough Minutes, where, and I'm sure I have read this before because it's one of my favourite quotes in our collections, There's a letter written in the Inverness Borough Minutes in which the magistrates of the town are accused of being aiders, assisters, maintainers and comforters of rebellion, traitors and open enemies to the king, and they're told that the Jacobites must surrender Inverness Castle or the whole town will be burned to the ground. And the Jacobites did surrender the castle. After the 15, Inverness Castle was fortified and renamed Fort George. And you can see again another link to the wider Highlands, because this is before Fort George as we know it now was built. So Inverness Castle was called Fort George, and then a purpose-built fort was built out at Ardusir, where it is still a fantastic place to go and visit. And as I said, these activities happened right across the Highlands. There are huge Jacobite activities in Nairn, in Sutherland, in Skye, in Lochaber, the Western Isles, all over. And it's really brought, you can look at the story of the castle and see how it represents the story of the Highlands. And of course, 1746, a date I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, was the Battle of Culloden. And Inverness Castle was blown up in 1746 by Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. They had lost at the Battle of Culloden. As they were retreated, they blew the castle up to prevent it falling into enemy hands. And we hold the treasurer's accounts for Inverness for that time that tell the story of that, of the bridge being damaged by the explosion that blew up the castle, of the sundial being smashed, all sorts of things. And legend has it, who knows if it's true, that the French officer who lit the fuse to blow up the castle, he died, but his dog, which apparently had been standing next to him, survived despite being blown across the River Ness. I once wrote that in an article and put an exclamation mark, and my line manager said, "Oh, you can't put an exclamation mark after that. It makes it look like we don't mind the dog getting blown over the river." But who knows whether that was true or not. And of course, the Jacobite risings, as I say, had a huge influence on the way that Scotland is both lived and perceived. After the Battle of Culloden, kilts were banned, the clan structure was dismantled, and those are things that are now absolutely synonymous with the Highlands. And I'm going to pause there just for a second in 1746 with the castle in ruins, while I remind you that these films are brought to you by High Life Highland at no charge to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no charge, no payment, and no subscription required to take part in these films. But if you are able to donate, then we would very much appreciate that, and there's a link to be able to do so in the text of this film. So we move into the 1800s, and again, I'm conscious that I might run over a wee bit today, but in my defence, I'm covering a lot of years here. So for about 100 years, the castle lay in ruins. The building collapsed, the stones were removed, and as always the way with these sorts of things, they were taken away, used in local buildings, things like that. And the castle site was turned into a quarry. But by 1818, there had been complaints that there wasn't enough court space in the town, and that it was a bit of an embarrassment for those involved in the legal profession when they had to come to Inverness on circuit, because there was nowhere suitable for them to hold courts and trials. And so they proposed to build a purpose-built castle, a purpose-built courthouse on Castle Hill. And the driving force behind this was William Fraser Tytler. Now, if you think you've heard me passionate about anything else, wait till you hear me talk about William. I love William, purely because the collection that his stories are in is just, there are so many stories in the Fraser Tytler collection, and that's what I'm talking about next week. So I hope you can join me when I talk about the Fraser Tytler papers next week. And William Fraser Tytler, he was born in 1777. He was a local landowner. He owned Aldowrie Castle on the side of Loch Ness. He was an advocate. He was a professor at University of Edinburgh, and he was the Sheriff Depute of Inverness from 1810 onwards. Fascinating character. And he wanted the court to be built on Castle Hill. He wanted to use it as a prominent site, and he said, and I'm going to read directly what he said, he believed that building a castle there would add a distinguished ornament to the capital of the Highlands. And so this was the building that we know today. So the South Tower, which was the one that you can see with the statue of Flora MacDonald outside it, that was built in 1833 to 1836. It's a castellated style, and it was built specifically to house the court service. And it was also built and designed deliberately to capitalise on its picturesque and prominent site, which I find really interesting. They knew it was a beautiful location and they wanted that to be represented in their design. And then the North Tower was built in 1846 to 1848, and that was built specifically to house the prison service. And there were 3 floors of cells, and the headquarters of Inverness Constabulary were on Castle Hill as well. And we have the Town Council minutes that detail all of this, all the discussions, all the decisions, and it's really wonderful to read them when you're so familiar with a building that's so prominent in the town. And so for the next 180 years, that was the castle. The castle was used as a courthouse. And as you can imagine, there are fascinating trials took place there, with stories from right across the Highlands playing out in Inverness Castle. And if you remember last week when we talked about the clearances and the Crofters' Wars, and I'm seeing somebody there saying that they really enjoyed last week, so thank you for that. The Crofting Wars and the clearances impacted everywhere in the Highlands, from Caithness to Skye to absolutely everywhere. And those stories played out in Inverness Castle. And I spoke last week about the Battle of the Braes trial in 1882, where there were crofters who had been denied the right to graze their cattle and had refused to pay their rent on Skye. And as a result, they had been taken to court in Inverness Castle, and they gained mass sympathy. And over a period of time, the treatment of crofters changed. And that happened for the whole of the Highlands and Islands in Inverness Castle. Mary Vore, who I spoke about a little bit last week, who was a very prominent Highland poet. She was from Skye. She was a poet. She was a songwriter. She was a Gaelic bard. She was the bard of the Land League agitation in the Crofters' Wars. And she herself had been imprisoned in Inverness Castle. She was accused of theft, and the common feeling is that probably wasn't justified in 1871, and she had been held in Inverness Castle as well in the prison. So all sorts of stories up to that point, and that takes us into the 20th century. The Porterfield prison was constructed at the beginning of the 20th century, and that meant that the prison service moved out of the castle and into the purpose-built Porterfield. And that meant that the North Tower changed into being county offices. And again, we have the plans for all of that. We have the original drawings for those renovations, and they're beautiful. And then the next kind of big date is 1932, for a bit more of a negative reason. There was a landslide on Castle Street. The retaining wall of the castle gave way, and no one was hurt at all. But the reason I'm telling you is that the houses were demolished round about, and so the landscape of the area completely changed. So up until really relatively recently, there were houses all around the castle, but now when you look at pictures, you'll see that it's cleared and we have this bit of land around the castle. And then in 1975, the police moved out of the castle area and relocated to purpose-built building on Old Perth Road. In 2017, we opened the Castle Viewpoint, which was High Life Highland and others opened the Castle Viewpoint so that you can go up the tower and look around at the view. And then in 2020, so just earlier this year, the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service relocated to purpose-built building, the Justice Centre on the Longman Road in Inverness, and that's allowed us to redevelop the castle. So you can see up until this point in history right now, the castle has played such a prominent role in the history of the Highlands. It's seen so many things which shape the lives of people in the Highlands and the view of the Highlands. And so I wanted to tell you what's next for the castle, given that it's currently sitting empty, and you can see, if you would like to, I'll tell you in a second how to do it, you can see a film of the inside of the castle as it looks right now. And so the next thing for the castle is that it is one strand of the Spirit of the Highlands project. And both the castle and the area that surround it are going to be developed. And all of these stories that I've told you are going to be kept in mind in that development. Now, the Spirit of the Highlands project is going to take place over several years. And the aim of it is to create a gateway to the Highlands and Islands. So it will encourage people to visit Inverness and learn something about what we consider to be the spirit of the Highlands, of the place that we love, and then encourage them to go out and visit the rest of the Highlands. So it'll help to boost tourism, it'll help to boost economic growth, and certainly will help with the recovery of COVID as that progresses. But it'll promote the Highlands through the medium of its culture and its heritage, which of course will be able to tell that I love that thought. And the project is supported, as I said, by the Inverness and Highlands City Region Deal. It involves the Highland Council, the Scottish Government, the UK Government, High Life Highland, and so many other organisations and groups locally and nationally. So what will it mean for the castle itself? Well, the castle is going to be redeveloped into a complex of public spaces. So there'll be a museum, a gallery, and attractions. And I'm seeing a few people saying this should become an attraction. Well, you've got your wish. There'll be a commercial development around about the site as well. So there'll be shops and cafes and restaurants, and probably some accommodation in and around there as well. And one thing that is going to be really prominent in the development of the castle and the development of the Spirit of the Highlands project is the role of the Highland tradition of the storyteller. There will be stories from all over the Highlands and Islands gathered to try and capture the essence of the environment, the culture, the character of the Highlands, and that's quite a lot. That's quite a big remit. And so the team involved, and I am involved in this project, but I am a small cog in a big wheel. But the team who are involved want these stories to come from you. So we want the development of these stories to come from the people who live in the Highlands, who work in the Highlands, who visit the Highlands, who are passionate about the Highlands in some way. If you have memories of holidays, of characters, of places, of myths, of what's important to your community, all of those sorts of things. If there are stories that without that we don't represent the Highlands properly, then we want to hear from you. Now, I know it'll be very, very tempting to comment on this page with those stories, but please don't do so. Please go and visit the Spirit of the Highlands website, which is www.spiritofthehighlands.com, and share your stories on there. There's a deadline of the 30th of November to get these stories in, so please do put them in and give us your stories. And like I say, anything at all that you think needs to be included to fully represent the Highlands. And the stories are going to be used in several different ways. So first of all, there's going to be the Spirit Autobiography, and that will be a digital archive of all of the stories that have been given. So all the stories that are submitted will remain on a digital archive for future generations to read, for present generations to enjoy as well. Some will then be used to inspire artists and in a series of commissions, and that will be the Spirit 360 project. So our huge tradition in the Highlands of creativity and art and culture will all be involved as well. And some of the stories gathered will form the basis of the Spirit of the Highlands in 100 Stories, which will be an exhibition in Inverness Castle. And like I say, it's quite amazing, really, for the first time in the castle's history, the people of the Highlands are being asked to decide and be involved in what is in that exhibition, and that's so wonderful. Now, the Spirit of the Highlands project will be much wider than just the transformation of the castle. That's one strand. Another thing they're going to be looking at is making the project really future forward looking. And so we have partners like the University of the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, other organisations. And they're also going to be looking into ways that the Highlands and Islands can lead in things like green energy, in community land development, in cultural growth within local communities. So the castle development is really just one strand of this project, but it gives us a gateway into all the rest of the Highlands. And as we've already seen, the history of the castle has always been intertwined with the history of the Highlands. If you have any questions or comments about the Spirit of the Highlands project, please have a look at the Spirit of Highlands website. There's a website, there's a Facebook page, there's a Twitter page, and if you contact them via those means, they will certainly be delighted to answer any questions. please contribute your stories. Please go on to the website and enter your stories about the Highlands. If you're in the Highlands, then please do drop into Inverness. No, I'm saying drop in. That's when the world was normal. Please do book to go into Inverness Museum and Art Gallery and have a look. They have currently got an exhibition both about Inverness Castle and about the Spirit of the Highlands project. So please do take the chance to go in and have a look at that exhibition as well. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been lovely speaking to you all and seeing your comments coming up. It's so much appreciated when you comment and chat back to me. Please join me next week for the phenomenal Fraser Tytler collection, which I'm very much looking forward to telling you about. And a final reminder before I go, that this series of films are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. And High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But as I say, if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would be truly grateful. And I hope I'll see you next week. Thank you.